Welcome everyone who is returning to school from time away, and those of you who are just starting and are coming to this, the first chapel communion service. This past 2 weeks, for those of you who have been around, the leadership of orientation has been riffing on the theme, Dancing with Gravity. And I have heard so many different interpretations of this image that it is now, perhaps, to use a theological term, oversaturated with meaning. Meaning that it ceases to surprise or compel because it has become too heavy with our words and our thoughts. As I've listened to many of the readings of this image, though there is one theme that returns again and again, and that is this, an image of a fundamental grounding tension between movement, freedom, uplift, and weight, burden, and grounding. The great theologian and Union professor Paul Tillich tells us that human existence is itself nothing more and nothing less than what he calls a series of antinomies. Also, one of Immanuel Kant's favorite terms, a set of tensions. Tillich describes the tension of being finite human creatures with the capacity to imagine the infinite. He describes the tension between knowing that we can move and shape and engage our world, and yet we are constrained by the form of our bodies and our history. And finally, the most perplexing tension of all is what he calls the tension between freedom and destiny. That we are people who are capable of making decisions and actualizing ourselves. We can make a world around us. And yet, at every turn, that making is constrained, in a sense, laden with the particularities and materiality of who we are in the world in which we find ourselves. Freedom and destiny. And for Tillich, to be a person of faith is to not be able to conquer these tensions. It's not to try to escape the boundedness so that one can fly, but it's rather to learn what it means to live within them, to be existentially fully present now, with both forces pulling at you. Today's passage takes this complex and yet refreshingly simple territory and adds another peculiar layer to it. In 2 Corinthians, we are given the image of bearing the weight of glory. Again, what a contrast. It seems like an impossible contrast. We hear the word glory, and in our contemporary context, we think of fame, we think of brightness, we think of light, air, that which is grand and lit up. And how could this possibly be wedded to a notion of heaviness? Paul, in writing this, was drawing on a long-standing Jewish tradition of thinking about glory in ways that are very unfamiliar to us today. Glory comes from the Hebrew word kavod, which actually means heavy, to hold heaviness. It signifies weighty importance. Most commonly, it's the word that is used to describe the honor that you are due your parents, the gravity of their place in your life because they have created you, the kavod of your grounding in relation to those who brought you into being. And then, as we see, it is applied to God to describe God's presence in the world. It is glorious, meaning it is heavy, filled with honor and majesty. So what does this mean about the kind, the understanding, the shape of the glory that as people of this community and as a people of spirit and faith and conscience in the world are called to be and do in that context? There's no theologian who has said more about glory than the theologian of glory, Jonathan Edwards. And he describes glory using many ancient Hebrew images, but he dwells on the idea of glory igniting in us desire. To behold the glory of God is to, quite literally for Jonathan Edwards, to fall in love with all the erotic passion that lies therein with the divine, to yearn, to want to be embraced, to find all of the joy, and he calls it pleasantness of life in God. What a wonderful image of falling in love and its weight. Jonathan Edwards takes this a step further that C.S. Lewis, in his little book, The Weight of Glory, opens up for us as he says the weight of this falling in love, this desire for God, is not something abstracted, but C.S. Lewis tells us that we find that in our common everyday interactions with other people. The glory of God, that falling in love, doesn't happen in a place called the infinite that is somewhere far beyond. It is the infinite that dwells in the ordinary. And C.S. Lewis, in great detail, says, frankly, when it comes to glory and knowing it, there are no really ordinary people. For in your life, you will never talk to mere mortals. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals who carry that glory, and those are the people that we joke with, that we work with, the people we marry, the people we leave, the people we snub and exploit and liberate, and the list goes on. C.S. Lewis adds, next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object present to your senses. It is there we find glory. And in a wonderful, wonderful overlap of image, Harriet Tubman reminds us of this same point. As she stepped across the line that demarcated her status as a slave, property owned by another, into a territory of freedom, she looked down at her hands and she asked the question. She wanted to know if she looked any different. And she describes looking at her hands, and she says, when I had crossed that land, I looked to see if I was the same person, and there was a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven, an image of that gleaming glory. But then she adds, I had crossed the line and I was free. She said, but there was no one to welcome me into the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home was still in Maryland because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, my friends, they were all there. And now I was free, and yet I wasn't. Glory means and demarks that space of freedom, and yet when we recognize the collective form of it, it is never complete until it is a freedom embraced by all. And finally, the contemporary philosopher of glory, let me now turn to him with a few closing reflections, is the man that I learned in seminary to refer to as Saint Fred. In a philosophy course I took, we had two saints, Saint Fred and Saint Malcolm. I turn now to Friedrich Nietzsche, rarely referred to as a contemporary Protestant saint. But Saint Fred describes the liberating weight of being saturated with meaning. And he calls being saturated with meaning being saturated with the infinite. He describes it as revelation. He describes the moment at which in his own life he looks at the world around him and discovers that that which he seeks to anchor him, to weigh him in the world, is not some ephemeral other beauty. It is the awareness that in this present moment, the infinite touches and embraces, in fact, weighs fully in all that is. For him, the concept of revelation, in the sense that suddenly, with an indestructible certainty and subtlety, something that wasn't there becomes visible, audible, something that shakes one to the last depths and literally throws one down, weighted, heavy, low. And this is a good thing. In the intensity of my feelings as I found this groundedness, it made me shudder and laugh already a few times. As I stepped into the space, I could not leave my room for the laughable reason that my eyes were inflamed, and from what? I had cried too much that day before entering each time on my walks, not sentimental tears, but tears of jubilation, tears of glory, wherein I sang and I talked nonsense, filled with a new glimpse of all that could be. I love you, eternity. Why do we need God waits? That heaviness of glory? We live in a world today, not so different from those worlds of yesterday, and yet it presses on us with an intensity never known before, where the logic of a market defines the be and end all of where our meaning as creatures lie. And according to Nietzsche, according to Harriet Tubman, according to Paul, if the weight of meaning is not there, those winds and trends and dynamics push you over. And it is the beauty of God that anchors us there. My sister, Serene Jones, is Deputy Attorney General in the state of Oklahoma and spent most of her time prior to taking on this position as a public defender who took on death penalty cases. She recalled for me, now probably 10 years ago, the story in which glory entered her courtroom. She was defending Leroy Troy against a murder accusation, and if convicted, he would have been sentenced to death. Leroy's mother, sat there throughout the trial. Francine was her name, and listened carefully to every word and found herself in constant prayer for her son's life. Unlike many of the cases my sister took on, in this case she believed deeply in his innocence. And a criminal justice system that had already set in force motions that were bound to take him not just to prison, but to his own death, weighed heavy in the room. But on the day that the verdict returned, to the shock of everyone, the jury came back, and after only 4 hours of deliberation, delivered the words, "Not guilty." And my sister describes Francine standing up in the courtroom and at the top of her lungs yelling, "God is not ugly. God is not ugly. Our God is a glorious God, and our lives in that weight will never be trivial." Amen.